Near the end of the service today, we will hear Charles' poem, Dear Friend and Gentle Hearts. But it seems we would be missing something if we didn't begin there as well. With these words, this greeting, Dear friends and gentle hearts, come gather round. Dear friends and gentle hearts, this is how Charles Klingler saw us, as his friends, as persons of open-heartedness, kind-heartedness, gentleness. He was a beloved presence in our lives, and we were a beloved presence in his life. He was our companion, our father, our brother, our teacher, our mentor, our friend, and the world is not the same in his absence. The world has changed, and we have too. Today we acknowledge that change. We grieve it. We also remember with fondness and with gladness all the time we shared together, all the words and ideas, all the beauty of classroom and garden and poetry and painting. We remember and we give thanks. So join your hearts and minds this hour. Join in delightful word and deep feeling. For we are blessed to have been together through this life, and we are blessed to be together now. Thanks be to God.
March. Ho for the lion that rules in March. Fierce and cold is his reign. Gray is the sky, and its wide sweeping arch frowns on the rigid terrain. But the snow and ice slowly are put on the march by the sun that is shining again. Ho for the lamb that in March has its reign. It has the lion beguiled. Softly the raindrops beat on the pane. Winds are refreshing and mild. And the sky, which smiles on the sunny terrain, is blue as the eyes of a child. Charles Klingler, age 14.
This is a poem my father wrote in 1941 when he was 15. It's called Thinking for Tomorrow. Life is all so clear today, yet I fear tomorrow. Trials strike the human way like a speeding arrow. Surely then, while all so clear, I must reach conclusions, for the mind to trouble near is weak to mad illusions. There were mad times in the past, many more are dawning. Then must I, when chaos fast will come with caverns yawning, garb myself in fortitude against its quick arrival, and, having in past reviewed it, well withstand the evil. Now must I in silence sit on the future brooding, while I yet possess the wit to cope with ill's foreboding. I must learn the thing to do when evils harp and harrow. Thus I'll build a courage new to live the mad tomorrow.
Let's stand. Let us now sing the praises of famous men, our ancestors in their generations. The Lord apportioned to them great glory, his majesty from the beginning. There were those who ruled in their kingdoms and made a name for themselves by their valor, those who gave counsel because they were intelligent, those who spoke in prophetic oracles, those who led the people by their counsels and by their knowledge of the people's lore. They were wise in their words of instruction. Those who composed musical tunes or put verses in writing, rich men endowed with resources, living peacefully in their homes, all these were honored in their generations and were the pride of their times. Some of them have left behind a name so that others declare their praise, but of others there is no memory. They have perished as though they had never existed. They have become as though they had never been born, they and their children after them. But these also were godly men, whose righteous deeds have not been forgotten. Their wealth will remain with their descendants, and their inheritance with their children's children. Their bodies are buried in peace, but their name lives on generation after generation. The assembly declares their wisdom, and the congregation proclaims their praise.
My earliest memory of Dad is riding on his shoulders around the living room of our house in Kokomo. It's a fitting memory because I feel I continued to ride on his shoulders throughout my life. I know all of us children feel that way. Dad was a teacher at work and at home. He was always available to answer our questions. As Becky recalls, he was our go-to guy for questions not only about writing and literature, but also about math, science, art, music, and the Bible. We could ask him anything, and if he didn't know the answer, he'd know enough about the subject to think his way toward an answer and take us with him on the journey. Dad loved learning for learning's sake. A career, he used to say, is the worst reason for an education. He was interested in almost everything. He was endlessly curious, and he believed in the mind's capacity to understand. His teaching of us children went well beyond academics and ranged from the mundane to the profound. Mark remembers Dad teaching him how to hold a photo by the edge so as not to smudge it. We all learned from Dad the proper way to turn the page of a book so as not to crease or tear them. David recalls that when he was about 6, Dad taught him and me how to fish and how to make bows and arrows. When David was 8 or 9, Dad introduced him to astronomy, taught him the names of the constellations, and encouraged him to be interested in science. When David was 15, Dad invited him to attend a talk at the college by George Gamow, the well-known theoretical physicist and cosmologist. This opened new vistas for David, inspiring him to read books by Gamow and others on relativity and cosmology, an interest that continues to this day. I remember Dad once chastising me for not doing something I said I'd do. When I protested that I had not promised to do it, Dad patiently explained that when you say you will do something, it is a promise, even if you don't use the word. And we all saw him live by that standard day in and day out. He was a stickler for honesty and accuracy in all things. We learned from Dad faithfulness to family and relationships. His love for our mother, Susie, was always obvious and unconditional. I never heard him speak harshly to her. On rare occasions when the stresses of raising 7 children became overwhelming, Mom would break down and cry. I remember Dad kneeling beside her, comforting her with soft words and caresses. They were a wonderful team for 75 years, as everyone who knew them together will attest. Our home had frequent guests, college families and students, church members, relatives, and others. At those times, the house rang with laughter. Dad had many fans, but his biggest fan was Mom. She would laugh at all his jokes, no matter how silly they may have been. At his retirement dinner speech in 1993, Dad turned to Mom and said, "Imagine coming home every day to that smile." But before I make Dad out to be too perfect, I must acknowledge one shortcoming we all knew he had, and that is sports. Dad simply had no interest in sports, ever. In fact, if you look on the back table in the narthex at his 1947 diary, the year before he and Mom were married, you will see this entry from January 4th. In the evening, we went to a basketball game at Anderson. I didn't enjoy myself much. Susie knew it and regretted that we had gone. Even his children's participation in athletics failed to spark much of an interest. When we children had athletic events, he sometimes dutifully attended, but usually with a book and a sheaf of papers to grade. When I was in high school, Dad told me that Manchester College coach Jack Jarrett had turned to him after I had completed a track event and said, "Well, it looks like you've got an athlete on your hands," as if Dad wouldn't know what to do with an athletic child, which was pretty much the case. Embedded in our family lore is Dad's own story of how he made one basket in his high school basketball career, in the other team's basket. But if Dad wasn't always there for his children's athletic events, he was always there for us in more meaningful ways. Tom remembers when he was class president in junior high school, and he had to give a speech to the student body the next day. He was so nervous the night before that he couldn't sleep. Dad sat by Tom's bed to keep him company into the wee hours, despite having classes to teach the next morning. Becky remembers Dad staying up with her until after midnight to help with a research paper when she was in grade school. He would read certain facts to her out of the encyclopedia, and she would write them down to work them into her paper. She would turn to him for another fact, and Dad would rouse from his slumber and read her the next one. I had a morning paper out delivering the Fort Wayne Journal-Gazette. Dad sometimes got up at 4:30 in the morning to take me on my route when it was extremely cold or raining hard. And then later he'd walk across College Avenue to teach a 7:30 class. Becky recalls that after we moved from College Avenue to Singer Road, Dad made a little paradise for children on our 3 acres, including a tree swing from the tulip tree on the hillside, a tree house in one of the big sycamores in the front yard, and a zip line from one tulip tree to another over the raspberry bushes. There was a flower garden, and at one time 5 vegetable gardens from which Mom canned and froze fruits and vegetables to last the entire year. At night, there were made-up stories for the little ones with characters like Christmas Tree Britches and his mother Hepzibah. Of course, no remembrance of Dad would be complete without mentioning his sometimes humorous, formalistic way of speaking. Becky remembers an occasion when Dad had taken her, Susan, and the younger children to Fort Wayne shopping. Ginny Keller, Becky's good friend, was invited along. At some point, Dad had become concerned with the strap on his newly purchased pair of shoes. Dad wanted Susan to observe the troublesome strap as he walked. "Susan," he said, "watch while I advance." On hearing these words, Ginny burst into laughter, which served to embed the phrase into our family lore, a phrase which otherwise might have been overlooked by his children as commonplace dad speak. And always able to laugh at himself, Dad found great joy in hearing this and similar stories repeated over the years. Tom remembers another experience we children have in common, and that is riding in our Volkswagen van, unseatbelted. There were no seatbelts in rear seats then. Sometimes sitting, sometimes moving around, and sometimes late at night lying on the seats or on the floor sleeping. An integral part of this experience was Dad behind the wheel, singing hymns or popular songs of his youth as he contentedly transported his family of 9 along the highways and rural roads of Indiana and his native Ohio. On one such occasion, Tom and Becky discovered that if they turned the window vent a certain way, it would blow air directly to the back of Dad's head, causing the curls of his longish hair to float in the air. Dad, without interrupting his happy singing, would run his hand down the back of his head to smooth the hair back in place. But to no effect, as the continuing stream of air kept blowing it back. Becky and Tom would eventually turn the vent back to stop the flow of air, and Dad would place his hand back on the wheel. After a few moments, the culprits would turn the vent again and giggle with delight as Dad again attempted in vain to tame his recalcitrant curls, never seeming to suspect the source of the stream of air. Beyond the delight he took in this childish game, Tom will always hold dear in his memory, and we all will, the image of our family bound together in a fragile vessel of tin and glass as our father shepherded us through fields lush with summer corn or white with winter snow to our destination and safely home again. John shares this more recent memory. During Dad's final year, as his Parkinson's symptoms advanced, Dad became more intensely focused on absorbing all he could from the books he loved most and from his 40 years of daily journals. In his final months, he spent many hours organizing the original copies and printouts of poems he wrote throughout his life. His passion for language and its meaning persisted to the very end of his consciousness, as did his joy in sharing language with others. One morning last August, Dad spontaneously began reading to John from page 1 of Thoreau's book, Walden. Over the next 90 minutes, in a faint voice, he read aloud most of Walden's first chapter, pausing occasionally to discuss the meaning of references to Greek mythology. He stopped reading only when it was time for lunch. Last December, Dad fell and broke his hip, and that seemed to precipitate a rapid decline in his health from which he never recovered. One afternoon, in the presence of Mark, a hospice worker, and me, Dad said, "You know, my favorite author was Henry James. You may wonder why I was so drawn to him. James once said, 3 things in human life are important. The first is to be kind. The second is to be kind. And the third is to be kind." Dad continued, "The fact that James said that is at least one of the reasons I appreciated him so much." To the end, Dad was a teacher and mentor. In his final days, there were many instances of his sharing bits of memory, wisdom, and encouragement, gleaned from a long life of reading, writing, learning, and full living. As I listened to him reflect and share, I felt like a child at the feet of a very wise old man. And that I was. And that, indeed, were all his children.
The world is charged with the grandeur of God. It will flame out like shining from shook foil. It gathers to a greatness like the ooze of oil crushed. Why do men then now not wreck his rod? Generations have trod, and all is seared with trade, bleared, smeared with toil, and wears man's smudge and shares man's smell. The soil is bare now, nor can foot feel being shod. And for all this, nature is never spent. There lives the dearest freshness deep down things, and though the last lights off the black west went, oh, morning at the brown brink eastward springs, because the Holy Ghost over the bent world broods with warm breast and with, bright wings.
We come now to our time for reflections. The first person listed in the bulletin is David Hoover, a former student of Charles. We are sad to share that David died suddenly and unexpectedly this past week. The Klingler family is so saddened by this loss and extends all sympathy to David Hoover's family during their own unfolding time of shock and grief. The second reflection indicated in the bulletin is from Bob Bowman, who will come to share now.
When I was a lad of about 7 or 8 or 9 in Northwest Ohio, it was a distinct joy when, after worship on a Sunday morning, Mrs. Klingler would say to me, "Bobby, why don't you come and have Sunday lunch at our house today? You and Paul can play all afternoon, and we'll take you back when we go to church this evening." Freeman and Pearl Klingler's youngest son, Paul, and I were great friends. We were both born in 1934, a few months apart. I enjoyed sitting around the table with your grandparents, although my memories of Pearl are more vivid than those of Freeman. And I suppose I was a little intimidated by Paul's older brother, Charles. To my little 8-year-old mind, Charles was practically an adult. He must have been at least 16 or 17 at the time. My father was pastor of the Pleasant View Church, and as pastors' families do, we moved on, and the Klinglers dropped out of my orbit. Imagine my amazement when 50 years later we moved to North Manchester and I discovered into the house right next door to Charles Klingler and Susie. The day our moving truck pulled up, Charles was out of his house, bringing John with him, and unloading the truck without even being asked. It was just a gesture typical of the generosity and the courteousness of Charles, characteristics that I found consistent as long as I knew him. The first 6 months we lived here, I was somewhat alone. My wife, Martha, remained behind until the close of the school year. And during that time, once again, it was a distinct joy when at the end of worship on a Sunday morning, Mrs. Klingler would say to me, "Bob, why don't you come home and have Sunday lunch with us today?" Frequent invitations to eat Sunday lunch with Charles and Susie, often joined by David and by Susan and Dave Hippensteel, continued even after Martha joined us, and in more recent years, until prevented by COVID and by failing health, our neighborhood meals at John and Ann Hartsaw's home continued that very long tradition of meals with Charles. Having Charles and Susie as neighbors was a gift I remember with deep gratitude. But as it turned out, Charles was not only my neighbor, he was also my colleague on the faculty at Manchester College. He was so gracious and thoughtful as he welcomed me as a colleague and helped me integrate into the faculty, inviting me to some workshops along with him. And he invited me to eat lunch with him at the college cafeteria. I thought, this is going to be nice, eating around a table with Charles once again. I didn't know, but he frequently ate lunch with Jim Adams and John Planer, and Charles was simply including me around that small circle of friends. Can you imagine sitting around a luncheon table with Adams, Planer, and Klingler, these three polymaths? For a second time, I was a little intimidated by this man, but thoroughly enjoyed the traditional and fascinating conversations. A neighbor and a colleague, and, as at the beginning of the story, a brother in the same church family. When Charles was asked to read scripture, he would read with an enviable sonority and gravity and precision that left me breathless. I think Charles's mind was always active, teasing out items of science and math and faith, and especially language. Charles had a love affair with words and their meaning and their uses, and it was one of my interests as well. One Sunday, the scripture story of Jesus eating at the home of Martha and Mary was read. Martha, it says, was cumbered with much serving. After worship, around the Klingler table, Charles led us on a delightful search for the origins, the meanings, and the implications of the word cumbered. Another time it was the word pied, as in Pied Piper. Words. But some of the words that I think of when I think of Charles, in addition to cumber and pied, are gracious, kind, precise, inquisitive, gentle, friend, generous, quiet, a reader, a thinker, a host, and a colleague. One more thing. Paul, that younger brother of Charles, died at the age of 10. Since I was the same age and a friend, I was asked to be a pallbearer at Paul's funeral. 80 years later, I have been asked to participate in this memorial service for Charles. I have come full circle. Charles Klingler was my friend.
Hello, my name is Peter Steves, and I wish very much that I could be with all of you today. My health doesn't allow me to travel right now. Otherwise, I would be with you, which is where my heart is. I was Dr. Klingler's student at Manchester from 1986 to 1989. I've been his student ever since, for some 37 years now. I hope that you'll indulge me, as Dr. Klingler did for all of those years, my calling him Dr. Klingler, even though he told me many times after I graduated to please address him as Charles. It just seemed an impossible thing to do, because he was in my heart and my mind as Dr. Klingler, and it was a sign of respect for me, and so that's all that I've ever used to address him. I could tell you so many stories about this man who changed my life so fundamentally, so foundationally. I have never met a more intelligent person, but at the same time, someone whose heart was so big. Dr. Klingler was the epitome of a scholar, of someone who lived and championed the life of the mind, yet at the same time cared very much about pragmatic things and making the world a better place and loving the people who were around him. That's a mix that we hardly ever find, and it's something that I have tried to live up to all of these years and have undoubtedly failed miserably. He not only taught me so much about poetry and literature and philosophy and life, but he went so far above and beyond what a teacher normally does to affect my life in such profound ways that we've been asked to speak only for a few minutes, and I suppose that's a good thing, because otherwise I would ramble on for hours and hours and hours telling you about things that I've never even said out loud to other people that Dr. Klingler has done for me. He asked me to stay with him one summer for a few weeks, he and Susie, when things were particularly bad with my family. It was the time in between going to Manchester and going off to graduate school to get my PhD in philosophy, something that I would not have done, probably, had it not been for Dr. Klingler, because my family had been evicted and we were homeless. I didn't have enough money to finish my classes. Dr. Klingler paid for me to take courses through the mail from Indiana University to finish my degree that allowed me to then enter the program, the PhD program in philosophy. But even more than this, he gave me comfort and compassion and nurturing when I could not find it anyplace else in the world. A year before, when I went home for the holiday break and my family once again had been evicted, we had just managed to get a small apartment, a one-bedroom for 4 of us, and I spoke to Dr. Klingler on the phone and tried to be very up and positive, but he could tell that that's not how I was really feeling. A day later, he showed up in Ohio, having made the long drive with a poinsettia and food for my family and a gift wrapped for me, making that Christmas probably the best Christmas that I've ever had. The news of his passing has left a hole in my life that will never be filled. Dr. Klingler, I would have loved you if you had lived forever, as you should. And I will love you forever. My heart is with you, Susie, and the whole family, and all of the friends gathered today.
First, I want to say thank you to the Klinglers for including me in this awesome service. I'm humbled and proud and especially glad to be here today. The first class I took from Dr. Klingler was The Age of Whitman and Twain. So we found a poem by Walt Whitman that we thought he would love. And I would like to close with a poem that all of us would have a lot in common with. It is an E.E. Cummings poem, which is, I carry your heart. Obviously, we all carry the heart of the Klinglers family. We're not going to worry about pronouns. We're just going to say it from our hearts. The spotted hawk swoops by and accuses me. He complains of my gab and my loitering. I too am not a bit tamed. I too am untranslatable. I sound my barbaric yawp over the roofs of the world. The last scud of day holds back for me. It flings my likeness after the rest and true as any on the shadows wilds. It coaxes me to the vapor and the dusk. It departs as air. I shake my white locks at the runaway sun. I effuse my flesh in eddies and drift in lacy jags. I bequeath myself to the dirt to grow from the grass I love. If you want me again, look for me under your boot soles. You will hardly know who I am or what I mean, but I shall be good blood to you nevertheless, and filter and fiber your blood. Failing to fetch me at first, keep encouraged. Missing me one place, search another. I stop somewhere, waiting for you. And here is E.E. Cummings say, from all of us, I carry your heart. I carry it in my heart. I'm never without it. Everywhere I go, you go, my dear. And whatever is done by only me is your doing. I fear no fate, for you are my fate, my sweet. I want no world, for beautiful, you are my world, my truth. And it's you are whatever the moon has always meant, and whatever the sun will always sing is you. And here's the secret nobody knows. Here is the root of the root and the bud of the bud. I carry your heart. I carry it in your heart.
I'm Nick.
And I'm Maya. We are two of Charles's 9 grandchildren who range in age from 8 to 43. My brother and I had the good fortune of growing up just a few miles from our grandparents, who lived on Pony Creek, south of town, across from the Hartsaws and next to the Bowmans, down the road from the covered bridge, an idyllic setting for many family memories.
As we celebrate our grandfather, whose presence loomed large in our lives from our earliest moments, we wish to share a few reflections and anecdotes about him.
One of our great privileges was growing up under Grandpa Charles's caring and observant eye, mostly during his years in retirement. This assemblage came together as we contemplated how Grandpa will continue to influence us as we navigate this new chapter of life without him.
Grandpa was a known perfectionist. Joey recalls that Grandpa would carefully arrange special rugs under our chairs at mealtimes to keep the carpet crumb-free. In a similar spirit, he would put us to work picking up sticks around the yard until the grass was virtually twig-free. I recall proudly presenting a copy of my senior college thesis to Grandpa after graduation. I had worked on it meticulously and had 10 copies hardbound to commemorate this foremost academic achievement. Shortly thereafter, I was touched to find the book near Grandpa's reading chair. But upon flipping it open, I found pencil marks covering every page, correcting a dizzying number of errors and noting many areas of improvement, for improvement. He was a known perfectionist.
Grandpa was a steadfast scholar and teacher. I recall that Grandpa turned every experience into an educational one. While my brother was in piano lessons, Grandpa and I sat in the car reading cartoons from The New Yorker, and though the humor was meant for a much older audience, he insisted I analyze and explain them while the pair of us waited for Nicholas's return. Danny recounts, I remember in college when I was struggling with the tedium of reading Shakespeare's plays, Grandpa shared that it took an inordinate amount of time for him to read the Bard when he was in college. I felt a lot calmer after hearing that he too had struggled with trying to understand the complexity of this literary master. He was a steadfast scholar and teacher.
Grandpa loved poetry. John recounts, I remember a pasta dinner during which Grandpa taught Nick and me the art of the limerick. I cherish this and other poetry-related memories of our grandfather, including the time I played a hip-hop song for him while the family was together for our grandparents' 60th wedding anniversary. He found it hard to follow the rapping of Jay-Z and Eminem, but he expressed admiration for the rhyming of Shakespeare with Saints Here. As I've become more interested in writing poetry over the years, I appreciate Grandpa's insistence on using rhyme and meter. John, I don't know if you remember this, but you wrote a long poem entitled My Epic Grandpa about the experience of sharing this hip-hop song, and I wanted to read your final stanza. I reflect how fortunate I am to have a grandpa so brilliant, thoughtful, sharp, creative, yes, but simultaneously a true provider of bread and spirit both to family. In the spirit of John's story, since 8-year-old James hasn't provided us his diary from which to pull an anecdote, we instead found a limerick that Grandpa wrote about him in April of 2020. There's no boy who's better than James. He's as good as his grandmother claims. He's shy and he's funny and cute as a bunny. I'm putting my money on James. Grandpa wrote many more limericks about James, the amazing boy from New Orleans. He loved poetry.
Grandpa delighted in sharing humorous memories. Mira recounts her own funny reflection. I remember his sense of humor and how much he liked to make others and himself laugh. One year, when attending a small Halloween party with my family, he and Grandma made a big show of secrecy about their costumes. They eventually emerged wearing large wigs, hats, clown noses, and masks, which were a full production wardrobe clearly designed to entertain my sister and me. Danny recounts, I remember how Grandpa fondly told and retold the story of sitting on the back patio on Singer Road. Hearing the bullfrogs croaking in the distance, I, aged 4 or 5, looked up at him and asked, Grandpa, did you burp? He loved that story and relished sharing it. Among Grandpa's favorite exchanges was this one from his 2 grandchildren in Columbus. Summer, Let's go to North Manchester so we can see if Grandpa's getting old. Mira, no, you mean to see if Grandma's getting better. Grandpa's already old. He delighted in sharing humorous memories.
Grandpa always took the time to help others. Mira recounts, I remember my grandpa's determination to help others succeed. I was nervous about my first high school humanities test, and my dad suggested I ask my grandpa for help studying. Though the subject was not his specialty, he took my list of notes and mock questions and kindly and thoroughly read them through with me after supper. I recall Grandpa as a steady and foundational fixture from my earliest memories to some of my most recent. In particular, 9 years ago, adrift in the numb confusion of losing my mother, his daughter, I remember Grandpa staying by my side as we spent hour after hour organizing her memorial service. Together, we worked through the minutiae and silently confronted our grief for this central figure in our lives gone too soon. I'll never forget his presence and partnership during those moments. He always took the time to help others.
There are so many more memories we could share about Charles.
Memories that exemplify the generosity, the wisdom, the creativity, the humility, and the humor he balanced so genuinely.
But we will close with these thoughts.
We are grateful to have spent so much of our lives in the close company of our grandparents. The best parts of who I am, who we are, would not have been possible without the love and support of Charles and Susie. So, thank you for everything, Grandpa. We miss you dearly. How fortunate we are to follow in your footsteps.
In the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth was a formless void, and darkness covered the face of the deep, while a wind from God swept over the face of the waters. Then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and without him not one thing came into being. What has come into being in him was life, and the life was the light of all people. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. Those two brief scriptures, one from the beginning of the book of Genesis and the other from the beginning of the Gospel of John, join together creativity, word, and light. In John's Gospel, Jesus is called the Word, Logos. In Greek literature, logos is word as a tool of persuasion, of logic. But in theology, logos is about divine reason shaping the cosmos, ordering it, describing it, giving it form and meaning. It is not just about persuasion, but it is about creative presence and power. God said, reports Genesis, and creation came into being through a word. Charles loved words. His was a life of words, but not words to persuade. Rather, Charles loved the beauty and creativity of words. To him, there was nothing quite so wonderful as a well-considered and well-created turn of phrase. He loved poetry, of course, but he also loved any space where words are chosen or crafted. So my engagements with him were often around word choices for sermons. From time to time, he would send me an email. That phrase, that sentence, he would say, was delightful, and it made me think of this poem, this poet. And off we would go on a journey of a companionship of words. I preached a sermon last Sunday that touched on a lot of social hot buttons of our day, and some people afterwards credited me with courage. That wasn't courage. Courage to me has always been more tied up with trying something different with language, taking a chance with an attempt to create a phrase I have never created before, something compelling, something heartbreaking, something beautiful. Often across the years, it has been clear to me that the attempt was successful if Charles thought it worthy. And in those moments, I would feel as though I had risen to a higher plane. In my office here at church, I've kept a basket of thank you notes and notes of encouragement from across the years, and I went through some of those notes a couple of weeks ago as another small step of cleaning out my office a little at a time over these remaining months of ministry here at Manchester. And in the basket, I found a thank you note from Charles, dated January of 2015. It was written immediately after a Pastor Appreciation Sunday. He wrote, "Julie spoke so well for all of us this morning that it seems presumptuous to say more, but when she spoke of you always inviting us to new pastures, I knew I had to comment. Milton's Lycidas, one of the great poems in our language, ends with the line, 'Tomorrow to fresh woods and pastures new.' The whole poem is actually a meditation on the Christian ministry, and I commend it to you. I reread it this afternoon and see again why it is considered a classic. You may say I read it in your honor, Charles." Who else but Charles Klingler would write a thank you note like that? I loved it. And what do you suppose I did when I got the note? yes, of course, I sought out the poem to read it, because when Charles commends something to you, you turn your attention in that direction. And of course, I read it again this week. And I've thought about that last line in recent days, tomorrow to fresh woods and pastures new. I do think it's a beautiful line. And I'm glad Charles offered it to me, not only for reflection on the day that he wrote that note, but for today as well. So he's still teaching me and teaching us. He's still offering the beauty of words, and quite honestly, I still see his face and hear his voice. How could I not? How could we not? The word is at the beginning and at the end. We hear it, and it continues to bring light to our lives. With gratitude and admiration and affection and longing, we remember Charles' life with us. His words, his wit, his expectation, his intellect, his kindness, and his mentoring of us all. We give thanks for all beauty, but especially the beauty of language, of word, of image, of inspiration. We give thanks today, and then we will turn toward tomorrow to fresh woods and pastures new.
Dear friends and gentle hearts, come, gather round me. Say while my breath departs, friend, you have found me. Tell me while daylight fades and tears are flowing, friends, wait me in the glades where I am going. Dear friends and gentle hearts, stay with me longer. Tell me that death imparts friendship the stronger. Tell me that there I'll know love still and laughter. Tell me that where I go, you will follow after. Charles Klingler, 1998.
Please pray with me. O God of supreme love and deepest mercy, bless us and keep us. Shine your face upon us and be gracious to us, for we have trusted you in life and in death. We have trusted you for this life and the life to come. Bless us and keep us. Shine your face upon us and be gracious to us, that our grief might be healed and our gratitude might ever expand. Bless us and keep us. Shine your face upon us and be gracious to us. Embrace us with your presence and give us your peace. Peace within us, peace among us, and peace for every day and every step that is ahead. Amen.